Hey everyone, nice to see you. Good morning. How are you feeling? Especially some of you who were up at 3 this morning with me. That was fun. It was great to meet so many of you over this weekend. Especially there's some people here, right, who have come here for the first time, and have come here maybe by themselves, and that is actually quite a scary experience to sort of rock up with a whole bunch of strangers. So, like, hats off and bravo to you if you've come here for the first time, got on a train or whatever, and sort of swallowed all of the sort of social anxiety or whatever it is and stepped in. That's impressive. So, great that you came along. Right. Oh, yeah. I've got to say this at the beginning because I always forget. These are all my harebrained schemes of trying to avoid a proper job. Books, podcasts, and whatnot. Okay, let's dive straight in. A few years ago, I was supposed to be getting profiled in the Daily Sport, great paper, and they wanted to run a story on me, and this was their proposed title and picture. Now, when they sent this to me, I had a couple of issues. One was that headline, "Possessed by Demons." We all have a fear of that happening to us. And I thought, do we? I've hardly met anyone who said, "Oh, I'm worried about the demons." But there was this little bit in red, which I had the issue with: exclusive interview with one of the UK's leading exorcists. And I had to message them and say, like, I'm not even an exorcist. Like, never mind the UK's leading one. The only reason why they were linking me with exorcism was because I write a film review column in the 14 Times, and there was a film called The Vatican Tapes, and they'd asked me to go to the premiere to talk about exorcism before we watched the film, and that's why they made that link. But even if I had been an exorcist, I still would never have attempted to claim to be the UK's leading exorcist, because surely that title goes to the man that I'm going to talk to you about today, a Scottish vicar who doesn't really seem particularly well known, but his life is packed with some of the wildest exorcism stories I've ever heard. From demons, vampires, sea monsters, and more. Brace yourself for a whistle-stop tour through the life of an Anglican exorcist called Reverend Dr. Donald Oman. He looks like a kind of chilled-out type. Well, it's O-M-A-N-D. And I've looked up and I've found all different ways of pronouncing it, and most people go Oman, Omand. Seems appropriate to call him Oman. Special thanks, by the way, to Richard Freeman, who first switched me on to this guy. And also a disclaimer: what you're about to hear is really wacky. Like, he did some really kind of crazy stuff, crazy claims. I already got half an hour. I'll try and make it shorter for time. And so I'm not going to attempt any kind of deep critique of whether what he believed was right or not. There's too much stuff to do that. I'm simply going to present his life to you as was presented only by him, but also his biographers. And so if you're like a believer and you're open to this, then you can kind of prepare for a kind of wild 40 ride. If you're a skeptic, just sit back and enjoy the life of a pretty kooky but interesting and quite dramatic character. And so, a brief note about his upbringing. Donald was born in Perth in Scotland in 1903. His dad was from the Orkney Islands. And his interest and his talents in the supernatural came from his family. Particularly his grandfather was a bigoted and stern Presbyterian minister who used to tell him really freaky, scary Scandinavian folk tales. But really it was Donald's mother that gave him not only an interest in the paranormal, but also the potential of him having some sort of gift. Because she was from the West Highlands, and She had a form of psychic awareness that Donald described as fayness or as the sight. I'll give you an example. This is not their actual living room, but it's a kind of a living room from around the time in 1914. A woman came to the family house, and they were sitting there hanging out, just sort of chatting, shooting the breeze. And Donald said that this woman who came was called Mrs. Scott. And as they were talking, they were talking about general stuff when he remembered that this woman had a son called Ray. And Ray was in the Royal Flying Corps. And so they were talking about just general stuff all through this conversation when suddenly Donald's mother, freaks out, leaps out of her chair and says, "Ray is coming down in flames. He's coming down in flames." Ooh. And then she wipes out on the floor. Later on, of course, Mrs. Scott got word that her son had been shot down in the plane on that very day when it happened. And so Donald was fascinated. Wow, how did my mom know this? Another time it happened where Donald was almost drowned while he and his brother were swimming in a lake, and Donald almost didn't make it. So the brother dragged him out, pumped all the water out of his lungs, and said, "Donald, you can't tell Dad, because he's not going to allow us to ever swim in this again, so we'll just go home. I know you almost died, but just forget it," right? They went home, bracing themselves to kind of lie to their dad, and the dad wasn't there. And I'm like, "Mom, where's Dad?" And she says, "Dad is out looking for you." "Why?" they asked her. And it turns out just earlier they'd been sitting, and suddenly Donald's mother had suddenly shouted, "My son is drowning!" And so he went running to get out. So you can see why for him Donald was just fascinated by this and was wondering about it. Now, Donald's father eventually became a minister in the Church of Scotland. I don't know for certain if this is him. The internet, when I was digging into it, potentially could be, but it might not be. And church ministry was something that Donald wanted to do himself. But his father says, you need to get some real life experience first. Me being, I've gone through training as a minister, but I kind of these days do podcasting and writing now and stuff, so I don't do that much anymore really. But when I first started my training, I remember other people who went for it, and they would often say, have you done a normal job yet? Have you just been a normal person? Because many people brought up in church, go straight to study. And so the same with Donald. He was like, just get a normal job, meet normal people to discover whether this is really what you want to do. And so Donald snagged a job as a reporter for the Northern Echo in Darlington, or Echo, the Northern Echo in Darlington. And his journalistic work took him to some pretty impressive and high-profile people. For example, he bagged an interview with Adolf Hitler. The more my beard is starting to go grey, I'm starting to realize I think the reason why Hitler had that tash is literally just because this part seems to go grayer later. So I just think he's progressively shaved it off and left the bit that's my theory. Anyway, he got this interview with Adolf Hitler and actually interviewed him 3 times. And obviously, when he became an exorcist later, people said to him, Did you sense the evil? Could you tell it was there? And he said something interesting. And Donald said, funnily enough, no. And all the 3 times I met him, I never felt there was a presence of evil, but I felt there was a presence of someone who needed help, he said. He said, this Hitler character was dreadfully unhappy and dreadfully lonely. He seemed strangely empty, almost as though part of his personality was missing. But then Donald did remark on a change in Hitler when he went to the Nuremberg rallies and saw him like this. And after seeing that, he said, at that point, it was very different. He was occupied by something much more powerful than himself. Certainly, it wasn't the pathetic creature I had interviewed. So for Donald, he's having this sense of, hey, maybe people have the potential of being kind of vessels for something supernatural or spiritual. This next section is entitled School Pervert. I forgot. It's just so I don't have to look at my notes so much. School pervert. So even though Donald, fully believed his mum had these psychic gifts, he wasn't conscious of having any particular gifts himself until a remarkable event happened when he was at college, when he was training. And it happened when a fellow student came to Donald and confided in him that one of the professors was sexually abusing him. Donald was shocked at this, of course, but wasn't really sure what to do, particularly when this professor was a fearsome figure in the college, and they weren't, how do you challenge, particularly back then, how do you challenge something like that? And Donald had said he had the reputation of being, quote, a pervert. One day, Donald walks right into a place like this, into kind of a study, and the abusive professor is sitting with his friend. And Donald said, you can just sense an atmosphere. You don't have to be psychic or anything to sense an atmosphere. There's something wrong is happening here, and he felt that. But what happened next shocked him. When he walked in and sort of broke this up, the professor turned to Donald and was like, "Get out, get out!" And he found himself just saying the words, "Get thee behind me, Satan." Just said these words out. And he says this, "To my amazement, this man just seemed to crumple up. He just slunk out of the study and showed no more interest in corrupting my friend." So Donald, he couldn't stop thinking about this, what had happened. Did he have not only the ability to kind of tell if there's an evil in the room, let's say, but could he even cast evil out? Did he have, thinking back to the demons of the New Testament, like what we've been talking about already, could he have that power as well? Well, he decided, I don't know, I'll check it out. So he starts investigating, he starts finding out. He goes into this PhD in religious philosophy, and he's eventually ordained as a free church minister. But the confirmation that maybe he really is this kind of exorcist character doesn't come until he meets it from a very unexpected source, the circus. Early in his clergy work, Donald worked as a chaplain to circuses. He figured, these are people who are quite superstitious or religious. They're traveling all over the world, and they don't necessarily have a kind of circus padre that comes along with them. And so he felt they needed religious support if they wanted it. And so he set up this ministry within circuses. I managed to find this Pathé News report from 1962, which features circus wedding. That's kind of jolly English sort of report. Here's a shot of Donald in it. I managed to track down of him hugging a chimp. It's never a dull moment when you're a vicar, mind. And he's at the reception, hanging out with chimps and clowns and stuff. And so he does this in England, but he also he's teaching. He's moving around, particularly in Europe, and teaching religious philosophy. So he was doing some teaching in southern Germany, lecturing there at the time, and he was also doing a bit of circus chaplaincy on the side. And so he went to this circus one day in southern Germany, and as he went in, he was expecting the normal, will you christen my child, and will you bless this tiger? They used to do that, used to bless animals once a year. Should have just set them free, really, but there you go. But on this occasion, something was different. They came up to Donald and they said to him, "There's something wrong with the strong man. He's changing. There's something weird about him." He says, "Tell me what's happened." Turns out that the circus had just recently visited a small town. And the strong man, who was very religious, decided to go to church to pray. And he went to church and he stepped into the porch of the church. But when he did, he noticed a group of people all surrounding a man. And they were all over this man, and he was like, "Ooh, I wonder what this is." But then, as they parted, this man turned to look at Donald, and he said that this man's face was one of the most evil faces he'd seen in his life. The strong man had said that. He was surprised and shocked. So disturbed by what this was all about, strong man rushes into the church and starts to pray because he's scared. But as he tries to pray, he can't find the words. He's struggling to intercess. And so getting even more freaked out at this, he tries to leave the church. But as he leaves the church, the group is still there, and he's trying to get past them. And then he says the leader of this little group starts laughing, and he notices that they're performing like the rites of the Holy Eucharist, but they're doing them in backwards motion. And so the strong man is like, oh, crap, is this some sort of black mass or something? And being a very religious person, he's freaked out. So he goes back to the circus that night, and he confides in the ringmaster and tells him what happened. But as the night went on, other performers were starting to worry, because the strong man, who's normally loved and gentle, starts being nasty. He starts stomping around and swearing and sort of just being really objectionable. And then some of the children of the performers, strongman starts running after them and starts booting them, starts kicking the kids in, right? So obviously there's a bit of an issue with the strongman. And so they said to Donald, we think he's maybe possessed or something, we don't know. And so Donald's like, oh crap, is this my moment? I don't know. So he says, I'll talk to him. Now, at the time, there was a show going on in the big top. And everyone's sitting and they're they're watching the lion tamer in the cage doing all this stuff with a lion and a lioness. And so Donald's like, well, I'm trying to find where this strong man is so I can do a kind of pastoral visit with him. They don't know where he is. And then suddenly the strong man bursts in. Imagine this is the state, you're in the crowd. The cage is here, and the strong man just comes up to the cage and starts like shaking it and rattling it with both hands. Obviously, the lions are freaking out, and it's really, really dangerous. And so some people who work at the circus try to get the strong man and stop him, but when they get to him, they don't even get to him. This strong man just passes out, drops to the floor, looks like he's fainted, and apparently, this is the claim, in this moment, immediately the lion and the lioness turn and go crazy. There's other animals in the cage. They seem completely chill. But these two animals go so crazy, they leap on the trainer and just rip him to death in front of everyone. It's a proper kind of bonus for those... Well, no, sorry, not a bonus. Shock. That's the word. It's a shock for the audience. And the circus people, like I said, are a superstitious lot, and they said, well, it's obvious what happened. You did what Jesus did. You cast the demon out of the strong man who picked it up at the church, and you've put it into the lions. And then now you're going to have to get it out of the lions. And so Donald had to go and start to pray near the lions, said a few words, and the lions just chilled out, jumped off their little platforms and just padded down the cage like nothing had happened. Just got a lot of blood on their beards. Donald couldn't barely believe this turn of events. His head is spinning at this. And this wild incident would end up reaching the press, not only in southern Germany, but, in America as well, where he was also doing some lecturing. And people would kind of flock to see this circus exorcist. Now, a little aside of something that Donald experienced, he was living in Beaconsfield at one time, and his reputation as an exorcist was starting to spread. And so he got a letter from a schoolmaster who was nervous, because this schoolmaster was very distressed because he had been on the coast, a place on the shore of near Whitby, a shore called Kettleness. I don't know if anyone's familiar with that place. Both are key locations mentioned in Dracula, particularly Whitby, but Kettleness just up the road. And this schoolmaster had been there. He'd walked on this beach and saw what he claimed was a huge black hound. And he was terrified of this, and so he felt oppressed by it afterwards. And Donald was really fascinated by this story and a little bit freaked out, because he remembered when he was a little boy, he and his family went to Kettleness and Whitby. And Donald was a huge fan of Dracula, Bram Stoker's Dracula. He thought it was better than Edgar Allan Poe. He says, like, this is top-notch horror. So he loved it. But he got really frightened when he went. This was a little boy. He had a feeling of kind of oppression and evil when he was in Kettleness. So this made him go, I'm going up there. You know, I remember my experience. You're saying there's a crazy black dog. We're going. So they hop on the train. They go up to Scarborough, to Whitby, and then they go to Kettleness. And both of them go out on the beach that night. And there's Kettleness. And they both claim to see the hound again. This is Donald at Kettleness, like many years later. But that night, they both see this hound, huge. So Donald, starting to get a bit more confident, starts, doing all of this sort of Jesus, cast them out stuff. And he says the hound vanishes. He goes back to the schoolmaster, who has kind of ran away back to the car. And unfortunately, the schoolmaster never gets over this experience. He has a nervous breakdown when he gets back to the Midlands, gets committed to a mental hospital, and sadly dies in his early 60s there. But Kettleness, I mentioned Kettleness because that connection will return in a moment. Now, around this time, Donald appeared on a BBC radio program, and as he was on this program, his comments, I won't go into what they were all about, but he was making a comment that really impressed the Bishop of Oxford, who called him the next day and said, look, you work for the Free Church. Why don't you come and join the Church of England? We want you here. And he said, okay. So he ended up becoming a Church of England priest, and he did this in Oxford from 1954 to 1971. But he retired from local pastorate in the 70s, because that's when his exorcism career really started kicking up a gear. Including a disturbing case of vampirism from 1972. Donald was a member of an organization called the Inquiry into Psychical Disorder, which was a group of people who got together to investigate cases of mental health cases where for some reason they felt it was too difficult to explain what was going on with the person. So they would gather together at conference. Someone would get up and say, well, look, I've got a patient. What do you think of that? And they'd get together and say, what about this? What about that? And it was a fairly open-minded place. So, a little bit like here, some people would start to suggest potential supernatural things to test and explore. And it was here that Donald met a Swedish psychiatrist who made a shocking claim. He said that he had a 24-year-old patient in a private clinic who was convinced he was a vampire and had a ravenous thirst for human blood. 7 years earlier, this 17-year-old boy had crept into the dormitory of his school, and just as all the boys were sleeping, had quietly got up onto one of the beds of another boy and just sank his teeth into this kid's throat and started guzzling away. Now, the kid obviously freaked out, but getting sucked like this, woke up screaming. All the other boys wake up, and they go in, and they have this kind of code of conduct, like, don't grass anybody up. So they say, let's keep this quiet. So they do, until, I think it's about, 8 weeks later, the vampire strikes again. But this time, he does it so badly that he tears a full gash in this kid's throat. And the victim has to be rushed to hospital, and they can't hide it from the teachers anymore. And this is when this boy gets immediately sent to a clinic. This is not the clinic, but, like a bit of atmosphere. So it probably looks a bit like that. I couldn't find a picture of the real clinic. And when he gets to this clinic, this boy starts to try and bite the throats of staff as well. And he does that a couple of times. But this psychiatrist apparently claims what he's worried about is some of the staff are coming to him and saying in private, I'm starting to get attracted to this thing too, this blood stuff. So this is apparently the claim that's made. And they're saying, what are we going to do about it? Donald's in the room, and a few of them are supportive of exorcism and interested in it. And so they say, why don't you try an exorcism? Maybe that would work, even as a placebo or as the real deal. And so he goes to Scandinavia, Donald does, and he carries out an exorcism on this kid. And during the exorcism, he freaks out, and the kid starts clawing at his face and tears open Donald's lip. If you've ever cut your lip, there's a lot of blood comes from that. And so they're holding this kid back, tongue lolling as he's trying to suck Donald's blood. But they get Donald off, and he's okay. And he finishes this exorcism. And apparently, after this happens, he's announced cured, because he decides he's not. There's a whole elaborate system of tests that they do with him, of like making him stand in front of a mirror, try garlic, all the classic things, and he passes the tests, because suddenly he says, actually, garlic's not that bad. So, yes, I can see why this is a bit crazy. But he was fascinated by this idea of vampirism, and he kept checking in with this clinic, and they said, months and months later, that the kid was still doing okay. And his family, who had shunned him up to this point, decided to accept him again. They moved to South Norway and stayed there. But Donald was called in on other cases of vampirism, including a patient who he later discovered, the patient didn't know this, but later found out that he was a descendant of Elizabeth Bathory, but wasn't realizing that at the time. But what's kind of cool and interesting is apparently Donald says that he interviewed the parents of this kid who believed he was a vampire, and they said, oh, we've been to England. We've traveled around England before. And they're like, oh, did you like it? And he says, yes, apart from we went to a little place on the coast, and we really didn't like it. We felt really quite disturbed by it. And he says, where was that? And the couple said, it was a place called Kettleness near Whitby. So for Donald, he's got this sense of, wait a minute, could there be like latent evil forces not only occupying people, but occupying places as well, that could hop onto another person? And this starts Donald thinking that he needs to start exorcising places. In fact, whenever you think of exorcisms, you probably think of a priest casting demons out of a person, but only a third of Donald's exorcisms were about people. Most of them were connected with sites and places that he claimed he felt had some sort of evil power. And one of them was particularly accident black spots. A few photographs here of the BBC made a little documentary about his road exorcisms when he would go to notorious car crash sites and cast out a demon or whatever he felt was, causing these crashes. And then apparently there was claims in this documentary that there were 17 accidents in the 6 months before the exorcism. The following 6 months there were none. I'll leave that to you to decide on the validity of that. But Donald first considered this idea of demonic accidents when he met an Austrian hospital consultant at one of these conferences. And this consultant said, look, man, we're having a bunch of people in our casualty ward who are having car crashes. But the thing we're worried about is they're admitting that they felt compelled to crash the car. And they were having repeated experiences of this. What could that mean? And one particularly freaky incident happened when Donald heard this from a student nurse when he investigated this. And a car crash victim confided in her that he'd been driving along on a country lane at night. There were two sides to the road. And he was driving along, and he just suddenly felt this compulsion, crash this car now. Have you ever had that compulsion? I have. Have you ever thought of driving along and the thought crosses your mind, you go, wow, if I have the power now to completely change the trajectory of my life by just doing that. It's just, wanting to throw yourself off a building or that sort of stuff. I'm not suicidal, by the way. I'm just, you think about these things when you're a weirdo. And so he was driving his car, and he had this much more than just a passing thought, a compulsion, he claimed, to drive into the car that comes next. Sure enough, a headlights come over, and he's driving along, and he said, I'm going to crash into this car. This man apparently was a strong Catholic and said, no, I need to pray. So he prayed and prayed and prayed. Please go away, whatever's influencing me. And it goes. He says it disappears, and he goes, fine. until he looks up and he sees the other car go, and the other car swerves deliberately and smashes into him. And so Donald's thinking, hang on a minute, this is more than just an individual thing. What happens if there's like a force in certain places making bad things happen? So that's why he started getting into black spot accidents, but also not only that, into sea monsters. In September 1967, Donald was taking a break from casting out demons to do a bit of caravanning on the shore of Loch Long in Rossshire, when he noticed the loch become suddenly disturbed and amazed. He saw two humps coming out of the water, the foaming water. Now, not content with just one sighting, he had another sighting, or he claimed to, in June 1968, but this time he was in the company of Captain Jan Anderson. And Anderson decided to take him out to a mysterious waterway in Norway called Trollfjord, or Fjord of the Trolls. That's a picture of it there. It's beautiful. And while they were out there at nighttime, they witnessed, both of them at the same time, two humps come into view, and Donald was scared because last time he was on the shore near his caravan. This time he's actually on a boat. And so he was quite frightened, but then the captain said to him, don't worry, it won't hurt us, they never do. And they watched this kind of thing in the water come, and sure enough, it veered off starboard, and they were okay. Donald, excited, says, let's follow it. You know, it's interesting. But then the captain said something interesting. He says, no, we won't follow it because it's evil. Donald's like, what? Why does it have to be evil? Can't it just be like an interesting biological curiosity? And this is when this captain starts telling him this theory that he believes that this is not even a physical creature, that maybe this is some sort of spectral creature, some demon or whatever, and that it's something akin to the serpent tempting Eve in the book of Genesis. Now, I don't know what Donald made of that idea at the time because it's pretty wacky, but then later this theory gained a little bit more traction for Donald in 1972 when he was at the Psychical Disorder Conference. And a Scandinavian neurologist shared his concerns about some sightings of a legendary creature at Lake Storgen. I was supposed to find out how to say that. I can't. That'll do. Storgen. This doctor wasn't concerned whether or not the creature existed or not. He kind of didn't care if it was real or not. What he was worried about was, apparently, he said, anyone who sees this, whether it's in their mind or not, are starting to fall apart afterwards. Their home life is starting to be destroyed. They're committing immoral acts, whatever they were, acts that they personally wouldn't have done beforehand. And he was confused at all these broken homes and things afterwards. And so they said to Donald, would an exorcism work here? This prompted much debate, of course. How on earth do you exorcise a stretch of water with a huge ghost dinosaur in it? But they decided to test it out by going to Loch Ness, which had its own, of course, creature. Donald, I've seen an interview with him where he thinks Loch Ness monster could have been the spectre of an ancient dragon. How about that? But he believed that Nessie had sparked a wave of drinking and drugs, broken marriages, and black magic interest in the locals. Remember, Aleister Crowley, had Boleskine House over there. And so, with the help of a Benedictine monk from Buckinghamshire called Dom Robert Petitpierre, they pored over a map of the loch, trying to figure out how do you exercise a stretch of water, and they came up with this. Are you impressed with how I plotted it out? That took me about 7 minutes, so be amazed. They decided to do 5 exorcisms, one at each kind of end of the crucifix, and then one right in the center. And they did it. June 1973, a 71-year-old Donald headed up to Loch Ness with Steve Roberts, a photographer, and they were met by Wing Commander Basil Carey and his wife Winifred, and they went and carried this out. And the BBC's nationwide program covered it, although this was a kind of recreation. They didn't film the actual thing. And it's good because the news reporter goes into the locals and starts asking them. It asks one guy, "Do you believe Nessie is turning the locals to drink?" And the guy just laughs his head off and says, "We don't need a monster to do that." Well, drained of energy, Donald was quietly confident that the rituals were a success, and he said, "There may be further sightings of Nessie. That doesn't matter, but I believe the evil manifestations around it will have gone." So that's not a very easy thing to test, of course. Donald went on to exercise that original Swedish lake and other things like that. But I'm going to close and wrap things up because of time with his last, really, I'd say his most ambitious exorcism attempt in January 1978 when he decided to take on the Bermuda Triangle. Yes. The notorious paranormal hotspot, of course, where travelers vanish into thin air, either by, UFOs, portals, sea monsters, time funnels, or, of course, natural phenomena that we don't quite understand yet. Who knows? But Donald had a different and quite unique theory. He came to this theory after he was sailing in that area of the triangle, or just near the triangle, in the 1950s. The boat that he was on got to a certain spot during a storm, and Donald was sure he could hear the sound of mournful voices, like not just crying over the waters, but almost like singing a lament. And he was listening to this at the sound, and his apparent, his claims of having second sight and famous